Distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, it is my great honor and pleasure to welcome you to the Chey Institute for Advanced Studies. Let me briefly introduce our guest, though it is hardly necessary in this room, and also this brochure includes his bio inside, so you can refer to it. Professor Victor Chey is one of the world's leading scholars on international security and political economy, a distinguished university professor at Joji타운 University and Korea chair at CSIS. He has long been a friend and intellectual partner of our institute. We are truly honored to host him today on the occasion of his new book, China's Weaponization of Trade. We live in a time when we no longer need to explain what the weaponization of trade means. We experience it. As a trade-dependent country, Korea understands especially well that economic interdependence now brings not only efficiency, but vulnerability. I reflected on this recently in two opinion pieces that I wrote several months ago. In my Nikkei Asia column, I wrote, "This is not simply oversupply, it is systematic displacement. China's industrial overcapacity is not just a market imbalance, it is reshaping manufacturing ecosystem across regions." And I also warned that this is not only an economic issue, but one of perception, power, and legitimacy. That leads to the next question: how should we respond? In a Korea Herald column on the idea of, quote, small yard, high fence, unquote, I wrote, "A high fence only matters if it surrounds something worth defending. True national resilience begins not with exclusion, but with clarity of purpose, not only what to protect, but what to grow." Economic security is not only about restriction, it is about strategic choice and long-term competitiveness. This is exactly where Professor Chey's new book makes such an important contribution. The book shows, with remarkable empirical depth, how trade and market access have been used as instruments of political coercion. But more importantly, it offers a constructive answer: collective resilience, not decoupling, not isolation, but coordinate management of interdependence among like-minded countries. I was very pleased to see how closely this idea aligns with many of the concerns I have tried to raise, though I must admit Professor Chey presents them with far more rigor and far more footnotes than I ever could. So let me close. I have really much more I'd like to say, but since there is so much I hope to hear directly from Professor Chey, let me stop here, and the floor is yours, Victor Chey. Welcome. Thank you.
Well, thank you, President Kim. It's a pleasure to be here at the Chey Institute. CSIS has had a long, and I personally have had a long relationship with the Chey Institute, and really are quite pleased to be back here. I also want to thank Professor Chey, Professor Son for joining me later on stage for our conversation, and former Foreign Minister Yun and many other friends, Professor Lee, many other friends in the audience. Thank you all for coming today to allow me to speak about this book that I have written with my colleagues at formerly at CSIS, Dr. Ellen Kim and Andy Lim, looking at China's weaponization of trade. What I thought I'd do is begin with a short presentation and overview of the book, and then we can transition to a conversation. So as many of you know, in Washington, D.C. these days, there is an ongoing debate about whether China will carry out some sort of military action against Taiwan by 2027. Some people say there's a 20% chance, some people say there's a 40% chance, Some people say there's a 60% chance. Nobody really knows. However, I think we can say with 100% certainty that China will use economic coercion against Taiwan and others by 2027. In fact, China currently is using economic coercion against one of Korea's neighbors, Japan, over what effectively was a restatement of Japanese security policy when it came to the Taiwan Straits. And we have seen an economic coercion campaign against Japan. Economic coercion is defined as the use of non-market mechanisms to weaponize trade in order to exert influence on the sovereign choices of another state. Economic coercion is different from trade protectionism. Trade protectionism was when you raise barriers to entry or you try to create unfair market competition environment. These sorts of issues are trade protectionism, protecting infant industries. That's not what economic coercion is. Economic coercion is the use of economic tools, trade tools, to try to infringe on the sovereign political choices of states. And while war is certainly bad, China's economic coercion is not just a trade issue. China's economic coercion is tied more broadly to the efficacy and the resilience of the rules-based international order, because countries that are afraid of Chinese economic coercion are not willing to stand up on territorial disputes, on democracy, on human rights, on an open liberal trading order. The list goes on and on. So it goes much deeper. The implications go much deeper than simply a trade issue between countries. So in this book, we have collected what we think is a complete data set of every publicly known case of China's economic coercion. Of course, here in Korea, what is most well known is China's economic coercion in 2016, 2017, after the emplacement of a U.S. THAAD battery in South Korea. We count over 600 cases of Chinese economic coercion since 1997, affecting 18 countries and 470 companies. But in particular, this practice of using economic coercion by China has heightened under Xi Jinping, during Xi Jinping's presidency. I know this is very small font, so it's difficult to read, but here is an example of some of the data that we've collected. The known cases of coercion against U.S. firms, Japanese firms, South Korean firms. There have been 278 known cases against U.S. firms. You can see 33 known cases against South Korean firms, 33 against Taiwan, and the list goes on and on. I emphasize that these are known cases. So as I said, we have a data set of over 600 cases, but we also understand that probably underestimates the total number of cases, because many countries and companies that are coerced by China do not want the information to be public, because they don't want the dispute to escalate. So the 600 plus cases that we have found probably underestimates the total number that exist. This is just a word graphic, very difficult to read on the screen, that gives you a sense of the number of companies that have been targeted. Basically 470 cases, known cases against companies on every continent in the world except Antarctica. And the ones that are in larger font basically represent cases where one firm has been targeted more than once by China's economic coercion. And you can see many of them are U.S. companies, but there also are Japanese companies as well as others. And again, in the book, we have all the information about these cases. The way that China carries out economic coercion for the most part is informal and unannounced. So by contrast, when the United States announces that it's going to carry out financial sanctions against North Korea in compliance with a UN Security Council resolution regarding WMD proliferation. That's a very formal, legalistic, coercive action that's taken by the United States. China's coercion is usually informal, it's unannounced, and they never admit to it either before or after the fact. So I actually think to this day, China has never publicly acknowledged that they carried out the THAAD sanctions against South Korea. I don't think they have ever publicly acknowledged that they did that, although we all know very well the extent of that campaign. Because these are sanctions that are not about protectionism, they do not fall under the purview of the World Trade Organization. And some of the actions that China takes, you cannot take to the World Trade Organization. So, for example, when China carried out the THAAD sanctions against South Korea, one of the things they did was they stopped group tourism to South Korea at the time of your Winter Olympics, the Pyeongchang Winter Olympics. It's very difficult for the U.S. government to take that to the WTO and say that that's some sort of trade sanction by China. China just says, well, our people just don't want to go to the Olympics. As I said, often there is no legal basis for the action, and it's not over market access or fair trade. It's purely for political purposes. Another example of this was China stopped importing salmon from Norway when the Nobel Peace Prize Committee gave the Nobel Peace Prize to a Chinese political dissident. China never formally announced a sanction. It just allowed the Norwegian salmon to rot on the dock, and the instructions that were given to not bring the salmon into the country were never delivered on paper. They were all delivered, the instructions were all delivered by phone or verbally, so as not to leave a paper trail. This weaponization of trade is a source of power for China undeniably, given the size of their market. The fact that every country on its own has great trade asymmetry when it comes to bilateral trade with China. And often China carries out this strategy in bilateral or dyadic format. It targets one country. It's targeting Japan today. It will target one country and put as much pressure on as possible. It generally won't target an entire group of countries. It will just target one country. And then often China is able to carry out these sorts of activities because there is no domestic pushback. If the South Korean government, for example, were to all of a sudden tell its students that you cannot go back to the United States to study and finish your degree, there would be probably a lot of domestic pushback here in the United States. But China doesn't have to worry about that in their country, given the nature of the political system. So the primary means of dealing with this is through what we know as de-risking. President Kim Il-suk talked about the small yard, high fence, the notion of de-risking, securing supply chains, reshoring, friendshoring, impact mitigation, helping countries that have been hit by Chinese economic coercion. And those are all important things that have been done and that need to continue to be done. But the dilemma for countries is that that you are able to use de-risking to secure one supply chain, but it doesn't stop China from attacking the next supply chain. So for example, today, China is using economic coercion against Japan because of Prime Minister Takaichi's statements on Taiwan. Previously, China banned light rare earth mineral exports to Japan over a territorial dispute in 2010. Japan secured that supply chain, so China today is not putting pressure on light rare earths, they're putting pressure on heavy rare earths exports to Japan. So China will just find another supply chain to put pressure on. Nevertheless, de-risking is important, but it's not the full answer. It's not the complete answer. In many ways, it's just half the answer. The real bigger question is how do you stop the economic coercion? Not just how do you respond to it, but how do you stop it? There are two ways to stop it. One way is to decouple from China, just to completely decouple, no longer trade with China. That, practically speaking, is very difficult, if not impossible. We do see decoupling taking place today. Again, as President Kim mentioned, the small yard, high fence analogy that the Biden administration uses in things like artificial intelligence, quantum computing, semiconductors. At the high end of emerging critical technologies, there is decoupling that is taking place. But on everything else, it's very impractical to decouple. So the question is, how can you stop China's economic coercion while continuing to trade with China, which is, I think, what South Korea would like to do as well. The answer that we put forward in this book is something called collective resilience, which for the professors and students out there draws on the literature on the so-called new interdependence literature on weaponization of interdependence, Farrell and Newman and others, but also combines that with traditional security deterrence theory. And it essentially argues for a NATO-type Article 5 collective economic deterrence commitment among like-minded countries that trade with China. And what that collective economic deterrent threat is the threat of collective retaliatory sanctioning on China's high dependence goods to deter the weaponization of trade. The threat to retaliate on China's high dependence goods. So what do we mean by high dependence goods? So we looked at the trade data that exists with regard to self-reported trade data that exists with regard to China's trade with all the countries around the world. And one of the things we found is that China actually is highly dependent in terms of certain finished products, intermediate goods, as well as luxury goods. They're highly dependent on countries, the very countries that they have used economic coercion against. And so what we found when we combed through the data was that among the 18 countries that have been targeted by Chinese economic coercion, there are almost 600 items where China displays high dependence. And by high dependence, we mean more than 70% of their total imports of a particular good come from that one country. Right? We chose the 70% number because it was kind of an arbitrary number, but by way of reference, I think people are very familiar with China's dependence on Australia for iron ore and other minerals. That dependency rate is at about 55%. Right? So we're talking about 70% or higher. So here you see among the 18 targets of Chinese economic coercion, high dependence items of at least 70%. There are almost 600 items with a trade value of $43 billion. We have this broken down by country. So you can see here, Japan by far has the most, 147 items. South Korea is here, is actually fourth with 95. Is that right? 95 or 93 items. High dependence items that China imports from South Korea. There's much more data on this in the book, which I don't have the time to go through, but let me just show you one example here. These are just some samples of high dependence items. One here for South Korea. China is dependent on the import of OLED panel displays. This is the HS code for those of you trade nerds, which are used for smartphones, televisions, monitors, laptops, other electronic devices. They're 94% dependent. In other words, 94% of their total imports of OLED panel displays comes from South Korea. Right? These are some other examples of significant things like Japan's silver powder, which is used for photovoltaic paste for solar panels, for the making of solar panels. They're 85% dependent on Japan. for that. Oh, and this is just an additional slide that just shows some select items, both finished products as well as intermediate products, where China has high dependency on Korea. Inorganic salts, ethylene, some chemical, many of them are chemicals. So a high dependence item is not simply that China imports most of it from Korea, but also that there are not easy substitutes. And again, so we collected the data. These are some examples. Well, let's use this one since it has to do with Korea. 94%, we said, come from South Korea. The next largest supplier is Japan at 3.5%, and after that is Taiwan at 2%. So if you add all that together, that's almost 100% of their OLED panel displays are imported from Korea. The other example I like here is silver powder, again, used by China to make solar panels. 84%, almost 85% comes from Japan. And then the next two suppliers, the United States and Taiwan, are like-minded partners, and they make up another 13.5%. So again, if you add that all up, that's almost 100% of China's import of silver powder comes from these three like-minded countries, all of whom have been targeted by Chinese economic coercion. And then this is the last graphic I'll show you. So it's not just important that they be highly dependent and that the first, second, and third suppliers are like-minded countries. There also has to be an inability or a cost for China to substitute domestic production for that particular good. And so these sets of charts basically show we measure what's China's domestic capacity, for example, in OLED panel displays, and compare that as a ratio to their total imports. So it's their domestic capacity over their total imports. So you can imagine if that fraction is many exponential of 1, then it's easy for China to substitute. But if that fraction, that ratio, is closer to 1 or less than 1, then it's very costly for China to find domestic substitutes. And so what's important about this graph is not all this detail, but you can see this is the highly costly line, and all of these goods that we have identified are highly costly for China to substitute with. All these imports are highly costly for China to substitute with domestic production. So, and then this here is an example. These are examples of goods that are not costly for China to substitute because they have a lot of domestic capacity. But everything else here is all under. We use the ratio of 2. But everything under here is far under 2, which means it's costly for China to find domestic production. One of the points of the study is to inform countries that, contrary to what they believe, they do have significant leverage with regard to dealing with China when it comes to the weaponization of trade, but they have to do it as a group. They cannot do it by themselves. South Korea cannot use a deterrent threat against China by itself. It can only do it with the United States, with Japan, with Australia, with G7 countries. It can only work as a group, and it requires a great deal of political will. It requires larger parties to reassure smaller parties that the coalition will hold together. It requires countries not free-riding off of the promises that are made in this collective economic deterrence coalition. It requires private sector cooperation, obviously, because many of these items are produced in the private sector. And it might almost seem like an impossible task. But the example I would point to here is that this has basically already taken place in Europe. In December of 2023, the EU announced the anti-coercion instrument, which was partly in response to the United States, but also in response to China's economic coercion against Lithuania, when Lithuania agreed to open a Taiwan representative office in Lithuania. And the idea about the anti-coercion instrument was somewhat similar, that basically EU countries had a toolkit. They didn't explain what was in the toolkit, but a toolkit of retaliatory measures that EU countries would use if China used economic coercion against another EU country. And as far as I know, in my research and trips to Europe and conversations with the equivalent of FKI in Germany and in other places, there has not been another significant act of economic coercion by China against a European country since the announcement of the ACI. The ACI has provided a deterrent effect on China's use of that. Right now, in Northeast Asia, in the Indo-Pacific, between the United States and allies like South Korea and Japan and Australia, we have nothing like that. We have nothing like that. And so China, as it is doing now, can just freely carry out economic coercion against Japan. And as some of you know, I've written about how I think that China will carry out more economic coercion against South Korea over the U.S.-South Korea nuclear submarine deal. I think there's a high percentage chance certainty that China will do that. They're just waiting. They haven't decided what they're going to coerce, and they probably don't want to have bad relations with Korea and Japan at the same time. So they're waiting, but it's coming. I think it's very much coming. Collective economic deterrence is not a trade war strategy, right? And here, you just think about nuclear deterrence. The United States provides nuclear deterrence on the Korean Peninsula. The U.S. provides this nuclear deterrence not to start a nuclear war. It is to stop a nuclear war or prevent a nuclear war. And the second point is that de-risking, supply chain resilience, these are all things that must continue. So this strategy is not in lieu of de-risking. It's a complement to de-risking. And then the final point I'll make is that whenever I give this presentation, the first question that I always get, so I'm going to anticipate it, is, what about the United States? If there's any country that looks like it's coercing economically today, it's the United States. And I don't disagree with that. I think there are elements of that that are very true. But at the same time, I believe that the U.S. phenomenon of economic coercion is temporary. It's not something I think that will continue forever. It is a temporary phenomenon that is attracting a lot of attention. But China's practice of economic coercion is over 3 decades old. It is a regular tool of foreign policy, and many, many countries and companies have suffered as a result of that. So my advice, not that the Trump administration is asking, but my advice to the Trump administration is stop tariffing your allies and instead bring them together in this collective coalition to address the real threat of economic coercion, which is coming from China. Thank you very much. Look forward to the discussion. Thank you.
Thank you very much, President Yu and the Chey Institute, Victor, and Ambassador Chey. So it was great hearing you, and kudos to really you and Ellen and Andy for this book and the really amazing set of data that you all have collected to use as really arguments based for this book that you've published. It's been out how much long? How long it's been?
It came out in the third week of January, so it just came out.
It just came out.
Yeah.
Although I'm sure many of us here remember you had a collective resilience paper written
Yes.
in 2023,
Yes.
which sort of served as the basis
Yes.
for the book.
Yes. Yes.
Anyway, so it is wonderful. But you pointed out one of the questions that many of people in this room are really thinking about at the moment. So I'd like to really start with that because we have a lot of people in the room, as President Kim has pointed out, who are extremely well versed in this area. So I'd like to sort of get an analytical read of the room. So I want to do a quick poll. Now, you talked about, of course, the book is called China's Weaponization of Trade. And he talked about the fact that these days, you know, when he talks about China's weaponization of trade, people talk, well, what about the US? So let's take a read of the room. So I'm going to give you 3 options. The question will be, which actor do you believe is the main perpetrator of the weaponization of trade today? Number 1 is going to be China. Number 2 is going to be the US. And number 3 is going to be both US and China alike. I'm not going to give you 4, which I don't know, because I think everyone in this room has an opinion. So with a show of hands, which actor do you believe is the main perpetrator of weaponization of trade today? All right? Number 1, China. Show of hands. Okay. 2, I think. 2, the US. More than 2. Yeah, I think about 12, I'd say, give and take. US and China alike. Show of hands. Okay. I think we've gotten the... So, and for those of you who couldn't see, number 3 got about 80% of the people in this room. Now, I think this is much more about maybe our perspectives and perceptions right now, more than really global politics, but it also shows, I think, the weaponization of trade, economic coercion is not right now about who is doing it, but it really shows that we're in an era where there's a global shift in global politics, and we're all trying to adjust. How do you see that, Victor?
So I would agree with the room. I think if we were to think about it today, the 2 biggest economic powers in the international system today are both using economic coercion. Right? I think there are differences. As I said, I think in the case of the United States, this is a fairly recent phenomenon that has gotten a lot of attention, but it really has not been the tradition of U.S. foreign policy. When the U.S. has used economic coercion, it has also usually been announced, formal, embodied in a law, an executive order, or a UN Security Council resolution, such as freezing Russian overseas assets for their war in Ukraine, carrying out financial sanctions against DPRK, things of that nature. And only more recently have they gone to overt economic coercion. Now, even here, by the definition we use in the book, not all of Trump's tariffs constitute economic coercion. So contrary to probably what many of you think, the Liberation Day tariffs, the tariffs he carried out against South Korea and every other trading country on Liberation Day, technically is not economic coercion. It is trade protectionism. Because from Trump's perspective, the average global tariff rate was higher than the average US tariff rate, so he was basically rebalancing. However, the economic sanctions he carried out, tariffs he carried out against Mexico and against Canada for fentanyl and for immigration, that is economic coercion. So there's a difference. And China, for its part, has also shifted, its strategy has evolved. So now they are couching more of their economic coercion in legalistic terms, using executive orders, national security exemptions, things of that nature. So the strategies are shifting, but yes, I mean, I think most of the other trading partners in the world today are currently de-risking from coercion by both the United States and China.
And on that point, I think we're going to bring in Ambassador Chey. Could you give us a little bit about your perspective on what you heard and read from Victor?
Thank you. for invitation to this prestigious places. First of all, Victor, congratulations. This is really seminal and excellent work done so far. As a national from a country who was severely affected by Chinese economic coercion from 2016, actually you just mentioned Chinese third retaliation was lasted only 2 years, 2016 and 17, but in the reality actually it's still lasting. It's not yet completely lifted up. I was surprised this Chinese coercion at that time, it was very strong, persistent, and systematic. It's very informal and a combination of formal actions at the same time. It was targeting specific country and specific company at the same time. And another surprise it was that the reaction from Korean government, we did not respond to the Chinese coercion, but we took kind of defensive measures like reducing dependencies on China or diversification. I mean, that was kind of actual reactions from Korea. And also, we did not investigate all these actions taken by China and the damages done to the Korean companies. There was no comprehensive documentations at all. Compared with the Australian case, Australian Policy Institute, ASPI, thoroughly studied the case of Chinese coercion against Australia for years, and they produced a comprehensive study papers, and they also enacted a kind of response strategies. But so far, Korea did not take any legal actions to prevent for the possibly forthcoming economic coercion from other countries. Japan, the case of Japan, 2010, when the Senkaku Island dispute occurred, thereafter Japan introduced a comprehensive economic security law, and the law just ordered to reduce dependency on China less than 40% on all strategic minerals or something like that. I mean, there is a kind of difference of reactions from the country. Japan's reaction, Australian reactions, and also reactions from European Union, just as Victor mentioned. It was kind of good examples of economic collective resilience to countering the economic coercions. I mean, that is kind of my experience, but I just would like to make a couple of comments to Victor and a couple of questions. Firstly, one of the characteristics of Chinese coercion is informal. It's very clandestine, quiet, and combination of informal and formal, and no legal basis. But just as Victor mentioned at the last stage, actually Chinese behavior patterns, policy operation is changing. China has enacted a series of legislation for last couple of years. Just kind of a mirror legislation copying US legislation. For example, strengthening export control regimes. And China also revised last year foreign trade rules, just giving more authorities for Chinese government to control importation and exportation at the same time. And China introduced a new regulation to control foreign investment. And also Anti-Espionage Act was enacted a couple of years ago. And that means Chinese economic coercion is not necessarily informal. I mean, Chinese coercion is getting more formal and bolder than beforehand. Another point is that in terms of export control regimes China is applying, China is getting more close to the examples of the United States. has been strengthening export control regimes nowadays. And for example, in order to sanction Russia, US adopted the new rules of export control, which is called Foreign Direct Production Rule, FDPR. That means any country which use any element of US technology or raw materials should not be exported to Russia without a prior license of the United States. And China adopted this rule last year and applying rare earth elements. Any country's product which contains more than 0.1% of rare earth materials from China should be licensed from China before the exportations. Exactly kind of a mirror regulation of China copying US examples. That means China is strengthening kind of counter strategies and actions when they are affected by any collective reactions from outside. This is kind of distinctive feature of changes of Chinese policies and practices, etc. Now, this is my comment. And informality issue is concerned, actually, the case of the United States. US president is sending a message through SNS. This is really threatening messages sending outside. And tariff is a very important tool to change the behavior of other countries. This kind of SNS have the real effect to other countries changing their policy directions or sovereign decisions. Tariff is the only tool. For example, the US is pressing other countries to remove non-tariff barriers of the other countries. That means that otherwise, US will increase the tariffs. That means in order to change the legitimate regulations of foreign countries to change, otherwise this country can get higher tariffs. And this is, I think, is economic coercions in other ways. And turning over to the collective resilience questions, I mean, this is excellent elaboration of the response strategies, just analyzing Chinese dependency and strategic values and substitutability and replacement of certain critical materials or something like that. Now, my question is, I have 2-3 questions. Number one is, in order to translate collective political will into real actions, I mean, we need a kind of a legally binding agreement or treaties, just like Article 5 of NATO treaty. This kind of tripwire engagement should be guaranteed. Otherwise, other countries could not support affected countries or affected company. Just for the case of Korea in 2016, 17, 18, when the Lotte Group was severely targeted, even Korean government did not compensate the damages done to the Lotte groups, and under which arrangements foreign countries can support or assist a company affected by Chinese coercion, financially or in other ways? I mean, that is a good question. What would be the form of a group of countries' cooperation in order to make collective resilience operational and effective and credible? That is my question. And additional question in that regard is that Article 5 of the NATO treaty is dealing with security arrangement, just forcing countries to be obliged. But collective resilience is a kind of a de-risking. But at the same time, the collective arrangement should force private sectors to get cooperated with the countries, with the government. Can it work, and how can let it work actually in the free trade prevailing world? That is my first question. Victor, you mentioned several examples of plurilateral or regional or sub-regional cooperation, such as Mineral Security Partnership or Indo-Pacific Economic Cooperation Framework, and also CHIP4 and Quad and G7+2, etc., etc. I mean, this is a kind of a group of collective political will, but this is not a group of the realistic and credible political actions. And there is a question. None of this, the current examples of plurilateral cooperation does not guarantee satisfactory the collective resilience actions. That is my frustration. And second is a question. Even if the collective group of action would be provided, and this, the countries who are participating in this group should bear in mind Chinese reactions and also the response strategies. You mentioned in the book that actually Korea is kind of cutting edge technology in the production of OLED and some petrochemical materials. But just for the case of petrochemical industries, China is controlling in this region completely last year, and Korea used to be one of the biggest supplier of petrochemical materials to China together with Japan. But nowadays, Korean petrochemical industry is now restructuring in order to counter Chinese competitiveness. Therefore, I mean, Chinese vulnerability is changing in the course of time, and also in the course of rapid development technologies inside of China. Then responding country as a group should also bear in mind the speed of Chinese technology development. And my last question, this is relating to ACI, anti-coercion instrument adopted by European Union. I mean, this is one of the credible examples of response strategy to the Chinese coercion. I mean, this strategy is consisting of 4 stages. Number 1 is information gathering, intelligence, what is all about of the coercion itself. And number 2 is consultation. Number 3 is diplomatic démarche and warnings to the affecting country. And lastly, striking back. This is a retaliation. I mean, this is a very much a logical sequence of actions with elevations. My question to you is that, can Asian countries, together with the United States, make this kind of arrangement in this part of the world? And what would be necessary elements to make it work? And what would be the difficulties, actually? We cannot make it. And can United States stand on the side of solutions, or can United States continue to be on the side of the big problems in this part of the world? Thank you. I have to conclude here.
Thank you, Ambassador Chey. I think you raised a whole host of questions, but if I could summarize maybe 3. He points out about China's coercion, economic coercion, which I think many have talked about the fact that China uses economic, especially when you talk about THAAD. It's the purpose is not maybe just THAAD in itself, but a change in behavior. It's sort of the tip of the spear that China shows that this is what happens if you go against us. And so it changes future behavior. On that point, he raises 3 wonderful questions in terms of, 1, the realistic aspect. Without a existing institutional organization like NATO, like EU, which is where ACI is backed, is it possible to have this kind of resilience? And to, of course, China's awesome ability to, I was actually looking at that chart that you look at and thinking, well, if China looks at OLED and they're like, well, we can get that 94% down to 50% in a couple of years. So there is the China factor as well. And third, of course, the realistic aspect. Can we in Asia put together something like what the EU put together in terms of ACI? Is that possible? And what are the realistic barriers? And of course, the US perspective, I think we'll bring in a little later, but US also becomes one of the barriers and the questions.
Great. Thank you for all of the excellent questions. So in the interest of time, I'll give three answers. The first is on, it is correct, there is no institution in which you can embed a collective resilience strategy in the Indo-Pacific or in East Asia today. It just doesn't exist. At the same time, though, we know that institutions emerge as the environment changes, right? And the environment, or institutions emerge to create order, and then when order gets disrupted, some institutions fail and new institutions grow up. And we are arguably in that period of transition right now. As we said 10 minutes ago, we are in a situation today where the two lead powers in the economic system are both weaponizing trade. This is an unprecedented situation. The two biggest powers in the international system are both weaponizing trade. So this kind of disruption creates opportunities for institution building, and an institution to deal. Institutions often emerge to deal with very pressing, obvious, and highly impactful problems, and economic coercion certainly is a problem. The second, in terms of China's retaliation, or as you said, Jie-Ae, well, China can be like, okay, well, we can just reduce our dependency on Korea and OLED panel displays to 50% within 2 years. So I guess my point would be like, okay, they could do that, but now there is a cost to their economic coercion strategy that did not exist before. That means if they are going to carry out economic coercion against South Korea, let's say because of the US nuclear submarine deal, they know that they will now have to bear the costs of rerouting their production chain when it comes to whatever it is, petrochemicals, OLED displays. So my point is there is now a cost to their economic coercion strategy that did not exist before. It may not be enough to deter, but it's certainly a cost that wasn't there before. Right now, every act of Chinese economic coercion, for the most part, is costless. There is no cost to them. So it's not surprising at all that they continue to do it, because they try to get a country to change its behavior, and it's not costly to them at all. So the whole idea behind a deterrence strategy is you're trying to signal capabilities and resolve and raise costs if they continue the same behavior. And then the third point about the difficulties of getting the private sector to cooperate, the political will, all these sorts of things. In the book, we talk about how this is extremely difficult to do. It's extremely difficult to do. But there are two things, two responses. The first is, 5 years ago, maybe we didn't really talk about industrial policy. I mean, we talk about industrial policy today like it's a normal thing, and this would require industrial policy. It would require, restructuring tax incentives, tax penalties, penalties to companies if they backfill for Japan. If Japan is retaliating against China on silver powder, there would be legislation in Korea that would penalize Korean companies for backfilling that silver powder supply to China, it would require a lot of domestic legislation. It would require industrial policy. 5 to 7 years ago, people would have said, that's impossible. We don't do industrial policy. We're doing industrial policy today. Everybody's doing it. And then the second point is that this undeniably is a difficult strategy, but both for company CEOs, heads of business federations, and government leaders, the choice is, yes, this is difficult, but if you don't do it, then your choice is basically to live in the shadow of Chinese economic coercion forever, right? Forever. You know, Korea faced it in 2016, 2017. As Ambassador said, it continues today. They've done it to Korea on urea also. And as I said, we're just waiting to see what they're going to do in response to nuclear submarines. Right after the U.S.-Korea shipbuilding agreement in the joint fact sheet between Trump and President Lee, what did China do? They went after 5 subsidiaries, U.S.-owned subsidiaries of Korean shipping companies, right? So, and again, there's no cost. So part of the idea is that we understand how difficult this is to do, but even beginning to organize, maybe not completing everything, but even just beginning to organize starts to send a deterrent signal to China. So at the G7 in Hiroshima in 2023, the G7 leaders plus Australia and South Korea agreed that they would not only de-risk, they would organize to try to stop Chinese economic coercion. Even language like that starts moving in the direction of not simply de-risking, but also trying to think about some sort of deterrent strategy.
Thank you. I think it's very telling that you're talking about the fact that this is the time, that although the difficulties exist, there may be no other time where you feel the need, especially as the contagion of this kind of economic coercion moves towards Washington and who knows beyond, that all of these difficulties need to be overcome. I'm actually going to now go to the floor.
네, 안녕하십니까. 저 성균관대 조성민 교수입니다. 질문은 영어로 하도록 하겠습니다. 제가 차 교수님과 저희 지도 학생일 때부터 영어로 이제 소통을 해왔는데, well, I'm very nervous to ask question to my teacher's argument, but let me try. So I guess since your book is about how to cope with China's economic coercion, I think the most enthusiastic reader of your book would be Chinese strategists. They might be waiting for your book to be published. I don't believe you have a plan to translate your book into Chinese, but I'm sure Chinese analysts would love to get a copy and study your suggestion of American strategy so that they can develop their own counter strategy to cope with that. And you have already covered some of that, but I like you to elaborate what could be the most effective China's counter strategy against collective resilience. My guess is that if I were Chinese, I would employ a divide and conquer strategy or drive the wedge among US allies by promoting more economic benefits to some countries like South Korea. So instead of economic coercion, economic inducement also can be a strategy to divide and conquer. So to make some country like South Korea a defector from collective action. So I'd like to hear your thought on that series of possible counter strategy. Thank you.
Interesting. What do you think?
Well, thank you for the question. So Professor Cho is a living example that you can get a PhD at Georgetown and get an academic teaching job, which we're very proud of. We're very proud of him. So yes, I think, so one of the things that we talk about in the book is how where economic coercion fits into China's overall strategy to influence others. So and broadly speaking, in the global South, right, China focuses less on economic coercion. There are exceptions, but they focus less on economic coercion, and they focus more on disinformation, being able to penetrate the information networks and influence the public narrative in developing countries, and they use incentives, BRI, right, Belt and Road Initiative, and other sorts of things. In the global north, where the finance needs are not as great, they don't really use BRI. They try disinformation with some success, but not complete success. And instead they use economic coercion, right? So certainly part of China's counter strategy is to determine whether their target is in the global north or the global south, and that will affect what sort of thing they use. With regard to a collective resilience coalition, I agree. One of the first things that they will do with a collective resilience coalition is they will look at all the countries in the coalition and find the weakest link. And they will target that weakest link to test whether Japan, the United States, others are willing to respond to help that country, or whether they're just going to free ride because it doesn't matter to them. If US and Japan free ride, then the coalition falls apart. It's that simple. So they will try to find the weakest link and target that. And so, as I said in the slide, one of the most important things is political reassurance, no free riding, and being able to have some sort of fund that they could use to help the targeted country. And yes, I agree that China could use differentiated strategies in order to divide the coalition. In fact, we're seeing it happen today. China is using economic coercion against Takaichi in Japan, but they just had a summit meeting, right? President Xi, President Li just had a summit meeting, and we don't see any reaction yet to the nuclear submarine deal. And you could argue China has been successful in getting both the United States and South Korea not to say anything about China's economic coercion against Japan. The strategy that we talk about in the book would compel Washington and Seoul to speak out and identify, at least acknowledge the fact that China is carrying out economic coercion against Japan for essentially a restatement of Japanese foreign and defense policy. But neither South Korea nor the United States has done that. And so that represents a success in terms of China's policies. And then the third point is, we use the UN Comtrade database to do this study. And that is a database comes out every year. It's self-reported by countries, their trade figures. And the interesting thing is, given that this project, we've been doing it really since 2022, we see the trade figure and dependencies year to year. And it's really interesting to see how China is aware of their high dependence items, and they are actively trying to reduce their vulnerabilities, their dependence, particularly on Japan. They're actively trying to reduce it. There was an aberrant year because of the war in Ukraine where China became highly dependent on the United States for corn and maize, which they were getting from Ukraine. But China's part of their counter strategy is also to reduce their dependencies. So this is a constantly moving and shifting game. And so the items that a collective resilience coalition would have to put in its toolkit will also change as the terms of trade change each year.
But when you're talking about the first one in terms of China pinpointing the weakest link, and especially in US, Japan, South Korea, I get the feeling that South Korea will always be the weakest link.
Yeah.
That be the case?
I think if we looked at a grouping of like the US, Japan, South Korea, Australia, right, countries that have all been targeted, Australia really stood up and took on the brunt of China's economic sanctions over COVID, and Japan has been trying to secure supply chains. I think if it were a grouping of that, China would probably go after South Korea. In one sense, some would argue that their economic coercion strategy has not been successful because South Korea did not give up THAAD. It kept THAAD, right? I doubt that the Lee government will give up the nuclear submarine deal with the United States, but still, of course, it has impact because it affects other things other policy decisions or non-decisions that South Korea made. So in the aftermath of THAAD, when the Trump 1 administration approached South Korea about closing off the 5G market to Huawei, the Korean government was not willing to give a directive to Korean companies, right? Because they were worried about THAAD or on COVID even, and building secure supply chains on PPE and things. Korean government was also slightly hesitant because they didn't want to make the Chinese angry, right? That's often what you hear, like we don't want to make the Chinese angry again, sort of thing. So it does have a longer lasting impact.
Just we look back, the case of Korea, Australia, and Japan, actually, in terms of Chinese economic coercion, I think Australia stood up very bravely because Australia has leverage to put pressure to China. For example, Australia exported a lot of coals and iron ores to China, and actually the trade ban by China against Australia is a kind of self-inflicting damages to China itself. And likewise, Japan has also leverage in terms of high technology items. But Korea, except semiconductor and some of a few items, actually Korea has no such big leverage against China at the moment. Therefore, I mean the response strategy of Korea would be slightly different from Australia or Japan.
Definitely. Back to the floor. Questions. I think we have. Professor Lee,
I do understand when you talk about China's weaponization of trade, it's not just a retaliation, but kind of a systematic instrument of political coercion. Probably that's why we've been working very hard to make a so-called collective resilience in the form of unilateral, multilateralism, or how to strengthen G7 and etc. And then now here comes the Trump. But I do understand, as a scholar myself as well, you published this book now. That means at least you've been working on this for 2 to 3 years, where we are still very active on making a collective resilience among the democratic countries, including the US and its allies. But now, as all others are concerned about the US, I think we have to think about China's weaponization of trade and US weaponization of trade. We have to think about both, but still, in my opinion, the more risk on US weaponization of trade has a significant negative impact for the global order. Because I think that is the number one is marketization of security is what I'm worrying. Because if China did those things, we, democratic allies, can work together to do something. I'm not talking about it's going to be successful, but at least we can try. But if the US did this kind of thing, although in your presentation you said the temporary, and that part I was doubt as well, but if it's a marketization of security, and I think the price of doing business with US might be more dangerous than with China. Because we do believe economic interdependence promise us for prosperity, not only prosperity, but also peaceful condition of the international order. But now, this price of doing business with the US can give us kind of a source of power and vulnerability under the name of the economic interdependence. I think we allies have to do something else. Probably that's why the most loyal ally to US, that is the UK, now visiting the China to do something else. The second is normative issues. I think if the US making marketization of security or kind of form of weaponization of trade, and I'm afraid that will weaken normative distinction between democratic coordination and authoritarian coercion. And that will eventually, if not in the short term as well, give a more leverage and excuse to China to do those things as their usual business. So my quick question is here that, by the way, the Ellen Kim, your co-author, she did a great job on kind of collective resilience one for my special edition of the journal. That is going to be published in 2 months, and I have a similar problem like you, because we wrote that from 2 years ago. So that the situation is a bit different now, by the way. But she did a great job. But anyway, my question is then, do we, regional and middle powers, should do something without the US? Or we still have to work together under the name of what you say, collective resilience, vis-a-vis China's weaponization of the trade?
Thank you. Thank you for the comment and the question. I'll give 3 responses. The first is, I think, so the first is, yes, when I give this presentation now, every time I say the word China, everybody's hearing the United States in their mind, because the United States is so obviously the main, attracting the most attention in terms of this. At the same time, I would say, like, as you said, Jie, we started this research, so the first article came out in 2023 in Foreign Affairs. We started the research before that. When we initially started talking about this, the reaction was extremely negative, right? That, no, you're starting a trade war, you're destroying the international trade order, things of that nature. These days, people don't respond like that. They recognize that there is a real problem in terms of both the United States and China, and people are looking for a strategy, right? And so while they're skeptical because they hear me just talking about China, and they think the United States, they're also responsive because they also are looking for some sort of solution. So that's the first point. For me, like, again, as I said before, I think the extent and gravity of what China and what Trump is doing right now is temporary. I think even if there were a Vance presidency to follow Trump, it wouldn't be the same in terms of this sort of real, like, in some cases, potentially illegal use of tariffs. And then the second point, and the message very clearly to the Trump administration, and we wrote an op-ed on this in the Washington Post when he was here in Gyeongju for APEC, was that Trump always wants to get leverage on China. He's always looking for leverage. And so this is a way to get leverage, and also stop tariffing the allies. If you want to gain the allies' cooperation and leverage on China, stop tariffing them. So that's the message. The second point is, I think you're absolutely right that we are in a period now where countries are de-risking from both the United States and South Korea. And I think what we're seeing with, like, Starmer's trip to Starmer's trip to China, Carney, the Canadian Prime Minister Carney's speech, Carney's free trade agreement with Indonesia, their efforts to get a free trade agreement with ASEAN. I think what we're seeing now is middle powers are they're not going to China, and they're not just relying on the United States. They are de-risking from both. And what's different now is they're also now starting to look at each other much more in a coordinated fashion. So whether it's IP4 or whether it's Canada and the EU, I think that's what we're going to see more of. So there will still be alliances, and there will still be de-risking, but we'll see much more middle power, perhaps new forms of institution building among middle powers. And then the third point, I think, for a country like South Korea is, yes, de-risking from China and from the United States, but in many ways, it's not the same, because Korea has already made its choice. When you think about the hundreds of billions of dollars of investment that Korea has made and will continue to make in all of the key emerging critical industries over the next generation or two, it's not in China. It's all in the United States. So South Korea is de-risking from the United States, but it is also choosing the United States over China at the same time. I doubt that that pattern will change. I doubt that we will see South Korea take $350 billion of investment out of the United States and move it to China. I just don't think that that's going to happen. The choices were made going back to Trump 1 and then through the Biden administration and now into Trump 2. So, yeah.
Thank you, Professor Chey. Thank you for your wonderful presentation today. Some people call me the sanction expert because my last post in the foreign ministry was the ambassador to Iran. So I'm familiar with the sanctions. So your presentation today, it sounds similar to the logic of sanctions. For the success of the sanctions, there are some components. We should use the choke points, and we should work together with our friends, and no free riding, and the private sector should involve. These are some of the key components for the success of the sanctions. And also, as you said, the European Union, they have the anti-coercion instrument, and also they have the blocking statute to compensate for the loss from the U.S. sanctions or something like that. And also, recently, the Chinese authority, they enacted anti-sanctions the instrument. If any companies join the U.S. sanctions and do damage to the Chinese authorities or Chinese companies, they are ready to retaliate. So in this context, for the success of the collective deterrence, U.S. should demonstrate your readiness to support your allies in times of the trouble with the Chinese. But sometimes we ask ourselves, can you expect the U.S. support in times of trouble with the Chinese? Probably not. Many times we answer, probably not. And we have some concrete cases, something like that. So you need the basic component for the success of this collective resilience and collective deterrence is the America's readiness to show your support in terms of trouble with China. So in this context, I'll pose one specific question. Definitely for China, the US and China, they have their own choke points. And for China, evidently China's choke point is their control on critical minerals and rare earth elements. This week, the United States, they hosted the mineral ministerials in Washington, D.C. And Korea has not signed up upon the proposal yet. But anyhow, this mineral alliance, do you think, how effective do you think it will be? Because why I ask these questions, there are many kinds of the rare earth elements, the 17 kinds of the rare earth elements, but light minerals and the heavy minerals, they all have magnetic power. But in case of we have a high temperature, light minerals, they lose magnetic power. So key elements, a key component for this, the permanent, the magnet is the heavy, the rare earth elements. But these four the rare earth elements, only China can provide. In the foreseeable future, only China can provide. So how effective this initiative it will be? And also, do you think Korea should jump in this new initiative or something? Because last 2 years, Korea has been the chair country of the minerals security partnerships. But nowadays, after we have the summit meeting with China, and now while we are dating with the Americans, we are also seeing the Chinese. So these kind of the dangerous games, if you try to have two sweethearts at the same time. So should we join this initiative, or how effective this initiative will be? Thank you.
I think you have a very specific question and advice that we need from you.
So let me start with the critical minerals. I mean, I think Korea should participate in any like-minded effort to try to secure critical mineral supply chains, because there really is no choice. China has a demonstrated record of weaponizing critical minerals. There's a demonstrated record of them doing that. So that is a form of de-risking that I think every country in the critical minerals partnership is motivated by. They're all motivated by the same thing, which is the threat of China's weaponization of these minerals. Second, your description of the sanctions on Iran, I think, is absolutely right, and it requires all those elements. The only observation I would make there is that I think actually collective resilience is easier to implement than sanctions against Iran, because when you're doing sanctions against Iran, you are requiring everybody to carry out the sanction. Everybody's being asked to do the sanction and apply the pressure for as long as possible until Iran changes its behavior. What collective resilience is saying is nobody's asking you to apply the pressure now, we're just asking you to commit to it. Commit that you will do it. And so in that sense, it's a step before carrying out the sanctions, and in that sense, it's not easy, but arguably compared to actually sustaining the sanction, it's a step before that. And then your first point on the United States role, yeah, I mean, I think that next year the United States is hosting the G7. The Trump administration is actively thinking now about the G7, the G20 this year, and the U.S. is hosting the G20. They're hosting G20 this year and the G7 next year. So they're actively thinking about these sorts of things. And the question comes up, like, can the United States play a role? Will it be credible? I think, for many countries, I would admit there's not a lot of credibility when China carried out sanctions on THAAD on Korea in 2016, 2017. You asked the Trump administration to say something about this to Xi Jinping, and Trump didn't. And so, as scholars here have said and officials said, we felt like we were on an island, by ourselves, being targeted by China. So it would require a forthright commitment by the United States and other major economic powers to say that they're willing to do this, they're willing to support this. And again, it's difficult, but the theory of the case is the ACI, right? The European Anti-Coercion Instrument. The irony of the anti-coercion instrument was it was partly designed to counter the United States economic coercion, not just China's action against Lithuania. And the European Union recently threatened that they might use the ACI against the United States. But it shows that a grouping can come together. Now, there's much more that the European countries have in common than a group of Indo-Pacific countries, which is why in the book what we advocate for is the G7 plus Australia and South Korea, sort of being one possible grouping you could be together that could come together, because many of the G7 members are already, or all the European ones, except the UK, are involved in the ACI. And the other ones, Australia has a demonstrated record of wanting to stand up against China. Japan is looking for a solution. And South Korea clearly has also been targeted and has leverage. So that's the grouping that we suggested because they're the closest thing to a like-minded grouping. Again, not easy to do and fully aware of the difficulties, but the alternative is to do nothing. And then we will forever live under the shadow and threat of Chinese economic coercion.
The other part of one part of his comment was that, Korea has continued the strategic ambiguity in a way, sort of hedging the bets between the US and China. Is this no longer an option for a country like Korea?
Well, I mean, I thought it was, I think that has traditionally been Korea's position, and I thought it was interesting that when your president came to the US for his first summit with Trump in August, of 2025, he spoke at CSIS, and he said very clearly that South Korea's strategy used to be economics with China and security with the United States. That's no longer possible. And I agree with that statement, but at the same time, as I mentioned earlier, I don't think South Korea is hedging anymore. I think when you look at the flow of foreign direct investment and the areas that this is going into, the sectors, it's all going to the United States. It's not going to China. It's all going to the United States, which says, to me at least, that South Korea, South Korean companies, they've made their bets for the future. They see, in spite of all the political noise and chaos in the United States, they still think their best bet for the long term is with supply chains in the United States and not in China.
May I add briefly? Actually, I fully agree with that. Korea already committed to actually strengthen relations with the United States economically, but that does not necessarily mean, just as Ambassador Yoon just said, that Korea is totally free from China. For example, 12 heavy rare earth elements were announced last year by China that actually China will enforce export control, but it was deferred for 1 year. I mean, this deference will stop from November this year. Actually, in the meantime, China will negotiate with the United States. That means actually Korea is 90%, more than 90% of this heavy rare earths. So Korea is dependent upon China actually. Therefore, I mean, the Korea is leaning to United States economically, but actually it's very, very difficult to strike a balance between the two hegemons.
Yeah.
We do have a chapter in the book on critical minerals.
Right.
Yeah, where we tried to use a similar criteria for looking at critical minerals, and I think we found maybe 5. I mean, not many. I mean, China clearly dominates, but we found, I think, at least 5 where there was some leverage that countries, if they work together, could use as a form of deterrence against China leveraging critical minerals. Again, it's not much. It's like using a stick to fight off a tidal wave, but there's still something there where there is some leverage.
Beyond that, if I could just add, in the area of future technologies, I think what has happened in terms of the weaponization of trade has shown the vulnerabilities of a country that is totally dependent on the U.S. or China, and therefore in areas like AI, for example, building of AI platforms, the push for sovereign AI is much stronger in part because of that. Now, we have some speakers in the back that I haven't been able to get to. There was a young speaker that has had his hand up for a very long time. If I could, yes, get to. Please identify yourself and ask a question or a comment.
Thank you so much for the opportunity to ask this question. My name is Daniel Seung Kang. I'm currently a PhD student at the Graduate School of International Studies at Seoul National University. Let me just get straight to my question. So you talked about collective action and leveraging China's dependence on certain commodities, but I also thought, could this not also be mutual dependence, or as we can say, mutual liability of China and also these bilateral trade partners? Like South Korea, which is an export-dependent state, China is an import-dependent state. But for export dependency, for most countries, China is the #1 destination. Could not focusing on this export dependency backfire, especially in a state when China is focusing on dual circulation strategies, where it's also keening on reducing import dependency, as you've mentioned just before, and enhance its domestic capability. So how can this collective action really keep China in check and also hold national economic interest of coalition states as well? Thank you.
Thank you for the question. I think your point about mutual dependence is not wrong. That's in fact where we should be if things are normal. If things are normal, we should be in a situation where countries are freely trading, they certainly that trade dependence certainly does create vulnerabilities. When Joseph Nye and Robert Cohen wrote their book about power and interdependence, they fully acknowledged that even though we were economically in an interdependent world, that trading created vulnerabilities, but the view was that nobody would take advantage of those vulnerabilities because the benefits for trade were too great. I would argue that China made a decision going back to 1979 where they decided they will use that vulnerability. They will exploit that vulnerability for political purposes, and they made the strategic bet that nobody would dare retaliate because they knew the rest of the liberal world, their liberal trading partners, still believed in the liberal international trading order and said that, China may be violating the terms of trade now, but in the end, it's okay because as they get rich, they will become like Taiwan, like South Korea. They will eventually become more like the West, right? Liberal, open political order. And of course, in a sense, as we talk about in the book, the continued Western belief that the liberal international order would prevail actually counterintuitively encouraged China's weaponization of trade because we let them do it. We didn't retaliate because we said, we still believe in free trade, and they will eventually open up, politically liberalize as they get rich. So China's weaponization of trade is certainly China's fault, but it's also partly our fault because we believed that as China got rich, it would become more like us, and it didn't.
저는 전북대학교에 있는 신동화입니다. 저는 식품을 전공했고요. 그런데 오늘 주제에서 조금 벗어나기는 한데 K푸드가 이제 세계적으로 굉장히 알려지고 있고 또 굉장히 많은 수출을 하고 있습니다. 근데 불행하게도 수출로는 우리 그 K푸드의 거의 70-80% 원료는 외국에서 수입을 해야 합니다. 근데 그 수입하는 대상국이 미국이와 그다음에 중국입니다. 근데 미국은 별로 문제가 없어요. 근데 중국에서 이런 식품 원료를 수입했을 때 굉장히 부담을 갖습니다. 그래서 이런 그 식품 원료의 수입, 또 중국과 관계, 그리고 앞으로의 식품 수급에 관한 한국의 전략, 이런 것들은 어떻게 생각을 하시는지, 또 차 교수님의 책을 보니까 뭐 식품에 대해서는 거의 얘기를 안 하셨는데 혹시 그런 것에 대해서 의견이 있으시면은 좀 얘기해 주시면 고맙겠습니다.
So I'm not an expert on food or K-food, but what I would say there is, yes, I mean, of course, Korea's exports of a product like K-food are dependent on imports, including from places like China. And what I would say is that the strategy that we talk about in this book is an effort to try to get us back to that place in international trade, where people have trust in the international trading order, countries are not weaponizing trade, they're not using the fact that I can hold back this item to stop Korea from exporting their K-food in order to make them give up on their nuclear submarine ambitions. This tool was always there in the past, but countries never used it because they benefited from the trading order. And so that is clearly a vulnerability for Korea. The strategy that we're putting forward is to try to get us back to a world where everybody doesn't have to worry about somebody weaponizing their production chain.
Could I follow up on that one? Because we're talking about protecting ourselves, but isn't that also holds the danger of escalation in terms, because North Korea says it uses its nuclear weapons for deterrence, but we still guard against it. It's still considered a very offensive power. So how do we continue protecting ourselves without this escalating and seemingly think like it becomes retribution?
Yeah. Well, I mean, it's a very good question. And again, going back to the security example, there are some who argue that South Korea should get nuclear weapons, right, to deter North Korea. Not to start a nuclear war, but to deter
Sure.
a nuclear war. But the acquisition of nuclear weapons also runs the risk of escalation. It's the exact same dynamic here. And I would say just we are at a point now where collective resilience is a risky strategy, undeniably. But the path we're now on, with China and the United States both weaponizing trade and then basically crushing middle power countries like, not just middle power, countries like Korea, Japan, the European Union, the path we're on now is just destructive for everyone. So 10 years ago, people would have rejected this strategy as unnecessarily escalatory, trying to start a trade war, all these things. But now people are realizing that we need to find a way to stop the weaponization of trade. And so it is we are kind of in a desperate moment right now.
And on that desperate moment, I'm going to turn to President Kim. Your comments or questions?
Thank you for giving me a privilege to ask a question. And while I agree with the concept of the collective resilience, a quick question just comes to my mind. Ambassador Yoon mentioned and noted its similarity to sanctions. And in the case of North Korea, which Victor Chey is another expert on that issue, collective sanctions were in fact quite strong and achieved a certain degree of success. Yet, even North Korea ultimately managed to find workarounds. Means one might say that this was largely due to the roles played by Russia or China, but viewed from the other direction, doesn't that itself suggest how difficult it would be to build truly effective collective resilience vis-a-vis China? That's my question. And also let me conclude with another privilege by inviting Professor and the Minister Yoon Young-wan to make any comments or ask extra question if you had that.
Thank you very much, President Kim, and thank you very much, Victor, for your very insightful analysis. And if you don't mind, I'd like to turn my eye on the current pending issue between the United States and South Korea. President Trump's decision to raise tariff rates from 15% to 25% because of his discontents with the slow speed of South Korea's implementation. What is your reading of this controversy and confrontation between two countries? And another issue related to this is I'm afraid about spilling over impact of negative impacts of difficulties in trade and investment cooperation between the United States, South Korea, into security area. I mean, there are some concerns rising on that kind of spilling over impact of trade issue into security cooperation between two countries. Thank you.
Thanks. So let me, on the first question from President Kim, yes, I agree that the analogy you made to the security side is equally applicable to this strategy of collective resilience. So what it would look like would be, as I said before, there's a collective resilience strategy in which, and I should say the collective resilience strategy is not that Japan would threaten to retaliate on 147 items. They would just need to choose one, and Korea would choose one, and the Philippines would choose one, and Australia would choose one. So the individual cost to each country is not very high. It's just one thing that is a high dependence item. But you can easily see that if China were to carry out economic coercion against Australia and Japan as part of the strategy Stop Silver Powder, that could be a leaky sanction if France then backfilled Japan's supply of silver powder to China. that's the same thing in sanctions. That's the role that China and Russia are playing in the sanctions regime in North Korea. So it's, but yet we still continue to advocate for sanctions, right? In spite of the fact that they can be leaky, we still advocate for them. It would be the same thing with collective resilience. We'd still advocate for it. On the tariffs, I think certainly with this administration in the United States, the trade and investment side clearly comes first for Trump. So in the joint fact sheet and every interaction we've seen between Trump 2 and President Lee, the first items are always the trade and investment items, which is completely different from the past where, like when you were foreign minister, when I was in the US government, when we made a joint statement, the security issues always came first and trade came later. And it's clearly reversed under the Trump administration. Where there's a lack of progress on the economics and trade side, there's a danger it could be linked to the security side. The only thing I would say there is that is the risk with the Trump administration, but at the same time, in the end, it may delay some of the security negotiations that need to take place and the progress that needs to be made. But in the end, I don't think it will obstruct it because the security concerns are too great, the issues are too important, and it's in the interests of both sides strategically to move forward with these agreements. So I would say that the delays or the linkages are tactical, but strategically I think that the interests will prevail and the security components won't be completely obstructed. They'll be tactically obstructed here and there, but I think they will continue to move forward because it's in the interest of both countries.
Thank you, Victor. Professor Cha. I think we all understand that we live in very chaotic times. I think Carney said it's the age of rupture. Indeed. And so I think the collective resilience is also something that we need to think seriously about, the pros and cons, and see how it fits into our overall picture. So thank you very much, Victor. Thank you very much, Ambassador Chey. Thank you very much, everyone, for participating. It was a wonderful discussion. Thank you.